Guys, today we're gonna be very, very strong. I mean, you saw the title of the video, right? So brace for impact, let's get right into it. So the other day I was scrolling through X and found some guy tweeting this. In this post he basically claims that the famous phrase DEUS VULT, which means God wills it, was never actually said at the Council of Clermont. And well, what can I say? Since I am a bit skeptical towards almost everything that I read online, I cautiously, asked under the post why you would even say that, and if there happens to be only the slightest bit of evidence for this kind of claim. Well, a few weeks later, I found myself in a Zoom call with this guy here. That's Georg Strack. He's the author of the Twitter post and, well, he's also a professor of the history of the High and Late Middle Ages at the University of Marburg in Germany. Yeah, that happened. Well, before our call, he had sent me an excerpt from his overarching habilitation thesis, which is dedicated to the analysis of papal speeches. And this brings us right to the topic, because the phrase God wills it is said to have been coined during such a papal speech, according to what you can read basically everywhere, right? So for those of you who are still wandering lost through the centuries and don't know what the heck I'm talking about, let me give you some context here. It's 1095. The church and the crown, more specifically the popes and the kings, have been quarreling for many years over who is more powerful. Like, who is allowed to do what, and most importantly, who is allowed to appoint whom as abbot or bishop, for example. This is one of the major points of contention in this dispute, and it's called the Investiture Controversy. Investiture, coming from the Latin term vestire, to clothe, which refers to the issue of who has the authority to bestow religious offices. In addition to that, there was this weird situation where next to the Pope Urban II, there actually was a second pope, a so-called anti-pope, going by the name of Clement III. This schism, this splitting of the church into several factions did, not really contribute to the church's reputation and significantly limited its power over the, very legitimacy of the role of the Pope, of course. So reforms had to be initiated to put an end to this weird situation. And well, in 1095, this whole investiture and schism thing still wasn't really resolved, and Pope Urban II called for a so-called Bishop's Synod in the French town of Clermont to discuss how to clean up this mess. So at the synod, there were all kinds of topics on the table. But here stuff gets kind of complicated already. For example, it's said that Pope Urban II gave a public speech at the synod in Clermont and talked about, basically the results of the assembly and what they discussed and so on. Now, the common narrative is that in addition to all the clergy guys, numerous lay people were present as well in order to listen. According to Robert the Monk, a chronicler of the events at that time, all those present were so moved by this speech that they shouted as one, quote, "It is the will of God, it is the will of God." And later, according to Robert, Urban added, quote, "Let this then be your war cry in combats, because this word is given to you by God. When an armed attack is made upon the enemy, let this one cry be raised by all the soldiers of God. It is the will of God, it is the will of God." And this situation seems to have been so heated up that this huge group of people fell into some sort of pious ecstasy, into something like a, spiritual mass hysteria. I mean, what an event, huh? That must have been quite massive. So what's the point then of this video, right? I mean, we got a contemporary source explicitly stating that the pious folks back then, well, literally cried Deus Vult, right? So where are we getting at? Yeah, I mean, we should always be very careful and explore, the context of all of this a little bit more, right? And Georg did that. And all of a sudden, weird things start popping up. So for example, there is a logical problem, as Georg points out, and it has to do with the entire setting of a pope giving a speech to the public.
The first thing that has always puzzled me is how this was supposed to work in terms of communication when the Pope preaches in Latin and then he's understood at the climax of his speech by a lot of people who, according to this chronicle, actually don't know Latin because they're only to a small extent clerics and predominantly warriors as well as women and common folks. So that hasn't quite made sense to me because typically popes preach to other clerics in Latin and they understand it, of course. But this account from Clermont is somewhat inconsistent in that regard.
Clermont ist da in gewisser Weise nicht konsistent.
But then there is another issue here which makes things now really interesting. So in total we have four different more or less contemporary sources describing the events at the Council of Clermont more extensively. These are Fulco of Chartres, Balderic of Dole, Guibert de Nogent, and our guy Robert the Monk. The point is, this DEUS VULT cry is only reported by one of these dudes. This means that only 1 out of 4 sources actually mentions this really catchy phrase that supposedly encompassed all the religious hysteria in a single sentence. Only one. I mean, if that happening there really was such an emotional moment for the masses falling into religious hysteria, one would expect it to pop up in other sources as well, right? Especially since we do know for a fact that at least one other author, Fulco of Chartres, was actually there when all of this happened. But even in his account, the DEUS VULT cry is not mentioned at all.
So that's already a first reason to cast doubt on the call of DEUS VULT.
In Zweifel zu ziehen.
So why is that? Why is Robert the Monk reporting on this DEUS VULT thing, but the others don't? First of all, we actually don't know very much about this guy, Rubertus Monachus or Robert the Monk, except for what he reveals himself in his chronicle. According to that, he was an abbot in a monastery near Reims in France. But what we do know is that he had a very specific agenda.
Dem geht's nämlich darum,
For him, it's about portraying this crusade very strongly as a genuinely papal and divinely inspired project.
Okay, so there you go. Our chronicler wanted to paint a positive picture of Pope Urban II. He was to be depicted as being in control of the situation, as someone who, guided by God's will, has a firm grip on the reins of this whole crusade business. This was necessary, of course, because Urban's role was contested, as we've heard, right? I mean, there was another guy who claimed to be, Pope as well, so you better take a stance for yourself then, right? Well, as the very educated historian he was, Robert of course knew that in order to convey his message properly, he also has to, emotionally engage his readers in some way. As we know, there is no good story without emotions. To do this, he uses examples that were known to scholars from antiquity.
Und das deckt sich dann auch mit gewissen
And that also aligns with certain guidelines that he probably knew from ancient military theory. Because in ancient military theory, it is customary that the leader of a military campaign must give his soldiers the signum militare. And that is exactly what Robert the Monk described for Clermont. The crowd spontaneously shouts this cry DEUS VULT, and Urban II then says, yeah, obviously God has inspired you because you are speaking with one voice here, and therefore this shall now be your signum militare. So the Pope quite clearly assumes the position of the military leader here.
Und des militärischen Anführers.
That's crazy, right? Guys, we have very good reasons to believe that the episode of the DEUS VULT cry was first and foremost a literary element that was inserted into the story, primarily because it had a good effect on the reader and emphasized the intended message. Robert wanted the crusade to be interpreted as part of the divine plan for humanity, and he wanted to place Urban right in the middle of a tradition of ancient military leaders. Of course, it was never his plan to report objectively or even impartially on what actually happened. No, on the contrary, his goal was to arouse enthusiasm for the crusade movement. And honestly, what better way is there than to let God's Spirit seize the masses and proclaim with one tongue, one epic sentence, DEUS VULT. God wills it, this undertaking, this crusade. All of the magnificence of God and the crusade condensed into one single striking phrase. That's brilliant. You could argue now, of course, that Robert the Monk was kind of, really confident to put in such an epic call for action, including this whole idea of the crusade being favored by the Lord himself and, this epic DEUS VULT thing. Yeah, well, you know why he was that confident? Because he wrote the text more than 20 years after Jerusalem was captured in 1099. So he very well knew that this entire enterprise would be a great success from a Christian perspective. That's pretty convenient, right? Anyway, so what does this all mean now? Well, most likely this phrase DEUS VULT was never actually said at the Synod of Clermont. Georg Strack therefore concludes that Robert, quote, fabricated this crusade slogan, DEUS VULT, in this chronicle, and there were actually other researchers before him who were convinced of the same thing. And he comes to this conclusion for numerous good reasons. For example, the lay people present would likely not have been able to understand the Latin speech of a pope, which means they would not have been able to fall into this ecstatic DEUS VULT shouting, well, simply because they would have had no idea what Urban was actually saying. Also, none of the other sources transmit this highly emotional event that one would think every chronicler would lick his fingers for to get hands on. Even the most credible and detailed source that on top was an eyewitness, Fulker of Chartres, doesn't know anything about it. Instead, there were entirely different reasons why Robert placed this DEUS VULT in the mouth of the Pope. It's a brilliant literary symbol that Robert creates with this DEUS VULT that totally serves his purposes. Now, after hearing this, we of course have to address the big elephant in the room, right? Where does the phrase DEUS VULT then come from? I mean, if it wasn't coined at Clermont, was it all made up? Is this all a big fraud by Robert the Monk? I mean, don't tell me that no crusader ever used this phrase DEUS VULT. Please don't. So in order not to completely destroy all our pictures of the Crusades, I can at least tell you this. For all we know, it actually was used by at least some crusaders, because the Gesta Francorum, which is arguably, the most important source for the First Crusade, actually reports on it. But in a very different context than the one of Clermont. Because obviously, there were some French Norman crusaders who, on their way to the Holy Land, moved through southern Italy and made use of the motto DEUS VULT on their way. That was most likely in summer 1096, and that's what the Gesta Francorum tells us about. So as you can see here, the call DEUS VULT did exist among some crusaders, but it was most likely neither coined nor used during the Council of Clermont, which in turn also means that the phrase was probably much less widespread than we commonly assume. Because it pops up later once in a while, of course, for example in the Historia Belli Sacri, but evidence is actually quite scarce, which is why we can safely assume that not every single crusader ever charging into battle was shouting DEUS VULT as he crashed into the enemy lines.
There must be war! God wills it! God wills it! God wills it!
Most likely not. The phrase just wasn't that well known, it seems. Pretty much unlike today. Looking at the whole picture and taking a glance at the historiography, it's pretty wild, honestly, how Robert the Monk and his whole DEUS VULT thing have stuck around as the main narrative for the Council of Clermont, despite the existence of other sources that are even known to be more precise. So why is that? Why do both the chronicles and scholars lean on Robert the Monk's fabricated narrative, particularly to this crucial point of the Clermont Council? Well, it's because Robert's rendition of the events at Clermont simply weaves a more compelling tale. And so it was Robert's account of Clermont that found his way through the centuries, because chroniclers and historians afterwards all wanted to tell a good story, of course. That's what Georg Strack showed in his work.
Und es ist einfach so,
And it's just that Robertus Monachus is overall simply a very well-written chronicle that achieves something that the other chronicles fail to do. It is taken seriously by historians in the 15th and 16th century. The other, in my opinion, more reliable reports, which usually serve as the basis for Crusade historiography in the Middle Ages, like in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, they are simply not as much appreciated by the humanists in the 15th century. They did not appeal so much to their ideas of a stylistically well-written chronicle as Robert's chronicle did. So it's Robertus Monachus who remains after about 1450 as the primary witness for the Council of Clermont. And around 1500, Robert's chronicle already gained a very wide dissemination and media reception, and in that way shaped the historical narrative in the early modern period.
Prägt dadurch schon in der frühen Neuzeit im Grunde das Geschichtsnarrativ.
Consequently, mainly Robert's version has persisted to this day, overshadowing predominantly the accounts of Fulker or others in our history books. That's the power of a really, really good story, isn't it? Have you ever come across a historical tale that turned out to be totally false and yet managed to hold its ground across centuries? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so drop them in the comments if you have some. So let's get real here. Instead of DEUS VULT, we should probably say something like Robertus VULT, right? I mean, Let's give credit where it's due. The dude was all about crafting a gripping story, and you gotta admit it, he kinda nailed it. And his narrative still has us captivated today. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.